This episode is brought to you by Competitive Edge Research and Communication. Competitive Edge Research and Communication is San Diego's premier polling firm dedicated to quality research since 1987. John Nienstedt, president of Competitive Edge, proudly supports Voice of San Diego and other local civic organizations. Welcome to the Voice of San Diego podcast, where we make sense of local politics, schools, housing, public safety, the civic issues that impact the life of a San Diego resident. We break it down so you can understand it and make educated decisions.
Everything that goes into our investigative reporting, the journalists, public records requests, the data crunching, and this very show depends on the support of people like you because we're a nonprofit news organization. Enjoy the show.
All right, welcome to those of you listening on News Radio 600 Kogo. My name is Scott Lewis, and I'm here with my friend Andrew Keatts.
What's up, my man?
And looks like this is a thing.
Yeah.
My other amiga.
What's up?
What's up, Sara Libby?
And just keep walking into the studio.
I think it's good.
Well, you're here.
Yes.
Here I am.
When you guys were kids, you had phones in your house, right?
Yes. I grew up in an era when we didn't have a rotary phone.
Yeah.
And it was cordless phone.
Yeah.
But we had the insanely long cord, like a cord that could go around the house like 4 times.
Yeah.
Or alternately, the insanely short cord where you were like confined to
Like a
very tiny space.
Yeah.
Couldn't like reach over and get a notepad or anything.
Right. But boy, that cord situation seems absurd looking back on it.
Well, one of the
To
things I
knock over
find
drinks and stuff.
Yeah, one of the things I find interesting. So with my kids, they're like 7 and 4 now. It's like they're entering that period where they should. In my past, they would have called their friends maybe and asked for them and asked for a day, and play or whatever.
Do you still know all your friends' phone numbers by heart?
I know a couple.
I remember. Like from when you were 10.
Oh, absolutely.
I could pick up the phone right now and call my best friends from when I was 10 years old right now.
I'll give you Jody Templeton's phone number for sure.
Yeah. Keegan Wilkinson's number is in this brain forever.
Okay. Well, and you'd answer the phone and they'd say like, "Oh, hi, Valerie." Like they thought that I was my mom because I had a high voice.
You're right. Yes,
that make me really mad.
That was an awful part of being a 10-year-old.
Well, so now I don't know how.
That's real.
I don't know the how that works with kids now, though. With like to get the cell phones and stuff. Now we all coordinate parent to parent. That's kind of weird, right?
Okay.
But we got a landline for our house because we wanted to. If one of us was like choking to death or something, we wanted the kid to know how to call 911, right?
Yeah.
And we just figured.
Otherwise, they'd have to run over to you, grab your finger, open your phone with your own thumb, and then call 911.
Right. We figured it was important.
Yeah.
The problem is that the phone rings now and nobody cares. It's like, remember you were trained as a kid when the phone rang, you're like, boom, you just like dart to it, right?
Yeah, and there was like
and
a
then
script.
somebody would get on the other line and you'd be like, "No, I have it."
I had a very specific script I had to answer the phone to. That
Yeah.
was like a thing that was regimented.
Really?
Yeah.
Like what?
I don't remember.
Come on, you do. You remember your friends.
Did you have to say Keatts residence?
Yeah. Like, thank you for calling Keatts residence. This is Andrew.
No.
You're one
No.
of those. Okay. So the whole concept of a phone is just completely lost here.
Yeah.
But I've been now trained to have a different reaction because that's where all the polling calls are coming.
Yeah.
And so
And this is the good stuff, baby.
like especially in the evening now, like I hear that phone ring and I'm like, where is it? And I just like dart for it. And sure enough, I dart to it last night and I got a poll. I got a political poll. And it caught my ear, caught my attention.
Yeah.
Made me think. So I got the recorder out. And they were asking a bunch of questions about the height limit along the coast. And I'm like, wow, that's bold. Somebody's going at the height limit. You don't do that lightly. It's not a task you.
Okay.
Was yesterday the greatest day of your life?
No, that was when Keith said he was going to have a kid.
That's right. That's right.
No, the coastal height limit's real.
It's a thing.
I warn anybody against touching that rail.
Or lightly. Be prepared.
Yeah.
So here was the sort of money question on that poll. Let's listen.
Press 4 if you're not sure. There is a potential proposal to replace the current infrastructure improvements for the surrounding community and would not be any taller than the current sports arena. Do you support or oppose this proposal?
He's got an interesting lilt
Delivery,
there.
yeah.
It's a cadence.
Sports arena.
It's like
Do you support this proposal?
it's a real person who's trying to sound like an automated person.
Yeah.
I think he's one of
It's
those
like, oh,
guys.
this is going to be a recording? So you want me to read it like a robot then?
Exactly.
I think they literally found somebody at the Kobe swap meet for it.
They're like, guys selling the Ginsu knives. Can you read this script for us?
So, wow. So it's not only did I get a political poll, but one jam-packed with news that there's a proposal to do a new sports arena. Now, we've heard stuff like this for years. Ernie Hahn, who manages the sports arenas, been pushing for a new arena for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
And what was interesting about this is a lot of questions about the height limit were specifically about the sports arena. So the sports arena itself was built in 1966 before the height limit. The height limit is, for those of you who don't know, west of I-5, passed in 1972. You can't have any building or new building over 30 feet.
Yeah.
So if you have one that was bigger, like the Catamaran and PB or whatever, those were built before that.
Yes.
And in order to get through that, if you want a building that's higher, like SeaWorld did with its roller coaster thing, you got to get a public vote, right?
Right.
So that's apparently what they're gauging. Would the new sports arena could it be as tall or higher than the current one? And also some surrounding buildings, what would they be?
We're speculating here because we don't have any more information, but we could also be based only on what was in that recording. We could be looking at something much like the Soccer City proposal, which would be a signature gathering initiative to develop this public land, which would, of course, skirt some CEQA requirements based on recent Supreme Court rulings. And now they might also be doing this through an act of the city government, but if that were the case, we would have expected to see some sort of RFP, which I don't believe has happened, to my knowledge. So this could be some sort of private initiative that has eyes on that public land and would be going through a process much like the Soccer City process.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, does it not say on your recording who it's funded by or who's asking the questions?
There's a name at the end that didn't mean anything to me. I could have done more reporting on this, I suppose. Seems like something I could try to answer.
We don't do that.
Yeah, well, this is speculate.
Right.
No, but it shows there's, that, first of all, what you just described is the route to getting big projects now, right? Almost.
Certainly a route.
Yeah. So
Although we don't
it hasn't
know
worked
if
yet,
it's
yeah.
at all successful.
Yeah.
It didn't go great for Soccer City so far.
So that's just interesting, especially with more housing that they plan. That area will be, there was a lot of discussion last night after I posted this that people were like, well, that might not get a lot of blowback. And I'm like, well, Point Loma has a way of getting fired up about things.
The coastal height limit is a very touchy subject.
Yeah.
I wrote an article about it and some of the effects that it had, and I was accused of going on a jihad.
Mm-hmm.
That
Yeah,
was an actual
jihad.
word.
Also, wasn't this like your third article ever?
Yeah, it was Scott's idea.
Yeah. So
It was the 40th anniversary.
Welcome.
It was 2012.
Yeah.
The 40th anniversary of, what was it, Prop D.
Yes.
And I was like, well, let's just talk about its impact, legacy.
Yeah. No.
Seemed like a great idea for your first, foray.
Yeah, that's fine. I
was
stand by
great.
it. It's okay. But one of the things that I learned from that experience was that while you would think that some people might say, well, I would be okay with granting some sort of easement to that regulation in the sports arena area because that's not all that close to the bay, to
Sure.
the ocean anyway.
would you think that?
Yeah. In fact, many people believe that it's kind of a line in the sand type thing. And if you start granting any sort of easement at all, then it's just a matter of time before the whole thing comes tumbling down.
Well, they were talking about in the poll, opponents' arguments against the height limit. I'm like, oh, yeah, really? Who? Like, nobody
No.
stands up as
Yeah.
opponents.
For instance, when I wrote those stories, Mayor Faulkner, who was then a councilman, just released a press release that was like, nothing's happening to the height limit.
Yeah.
We're not doing anything to the height limit.
Proactively.
Yeah.
Nobody's like,
Yeah.
yeah, well, but one of their points was like, well, they're focusing on this Midway area, and I'm like, that's what everybody always brings up, right?
Yeah.
Whenever they're talking about vulnerabilities or things that we should consider changing about the coastal height limit, they always bring up the sports arena area. They're like, why does that's not a coastal view? It's not like,
Right.
let homes go there maybe.
Post office
Right.
on Pacific Avenue is also, or Pacific Highway is also another
Right.
thing that comes up a lot.
Right. So we'll see what happens with that. We'll do some reporting. Let Ernie Hahn be a good guest. We should bring him in.
Yeah, he would be a good guest. Ernie Hahn, in addition to running Sports Arena for years, was also one of the folks who was involved in that kind of back channel email string opposing Soccer City back the summer, along with Perry Dealey and a bunch of other well-placed local developers.
Now, let's be clear. That land, Sports Arena, is city land.
Yeah, that's city property.
And the city cannot sell that land if it goes 80 acres or more without a vote of the people. So ostensibly, whatever private thing they work out would maybe be structured like Soccer City, where there would be like a part of it sold or whatever.
You could very easily imagine it being just like Soccer City. It'd be a different arrangement of uses and whatever, but
yeah, I mean the wording, even in addition to the plan being the same, is no
tax
public money, but it's still public land, and so
Right.
there's that to grapple with.
Yes.
And the Kobe swap meet is no small thing, dude. That would be a big problem.
Yeah,
Like,
I've
people love
learned
that thing.
That is the most San Diego thing that's ever been said on this podcast.
I was going to say, I've learned in the years of covering San Diego that whenever this discussion comes up, inevitably people bring up Kobe's, and I am surprised anew that is a thing that people care about.
People
so
really do. I buy comics there
I'm
sometimes.
prepared to be surprised again.
If you want to get a funnel cake, 3 comic books, and a wrench.
We got a
No
coffee
better
table
place
that
than
we used for like 14 years there.
Yeah, it's not. I actually really do like it. It's just funny how territorial people are over it.
I'm just saying.
Yeah,
People care about it. All right, so Elisa Halverstadt, boy, she's been on a roll.
Yep.
Yeah.
She did a piece this week about the kind of slow roll of the the hepatitis A outbreak and crisis. And I really like the person and the stories she found. She found 2 patients who have dealt with Hep A. One of them was Ed Blitz. He was a retired accountant in Bankers Hill, kind of shocked to learn he got hepatitis A. And he got it in June. And the outbreak had been going on for 3 months at that time. And he hadn't heard that there was an outbreak. And her story does a really good job of trying to figure out why, right?
Right.
And so I think that, like, basically, if I were to sum up why and see what you say, is the county, and to some extent the city, but I think really the county assumed that it was isolated to the homeless community and that their approach to dealing with it through vaccinations was enough.
Yeah, I think that's what comes through. And she goes through a lot of different issues that are a lot of different potential responses that are discussed at various points, and then kind of spells out what happened or where the ball was dropped in terms of implementing them. And I think you could imagine a discussion about whether each of those solutions would have been sufficient or even substantial or meaningful in its own right. But apart from that, there is just no sense of urgency. There was just, at no point was there any evidence that anyone was worried about doing something.
Yeah, and I don't even think it's right to say the ball was dropped, because if this was like some everyday typical bureaucratic problem, then taking 2 months to hash out a plan to put up posters in a public library would be perfectly fine. And so the ball didn't get dropped. There were posters eventually after 2 months of emails, but this was not a typical everyday problem, and it required a different way of addressing the issue.
Yeah, exactly. It's just business as usual.
Yeah.
Throughout these emails, there's no one. So, for instance, they'll be at a meeting. They're at a meeting at some point, and then somebody discusses something like these posters.
Mm-hmm.
And then no one talks about it again for like a month.
Right.
And when that next email follows up on it, they don't say, hey, it's been a month. What's going on with this poster thing? It's just very matter of fact. Like, oh, we had talked about those posters. What's going on with that?
Right. One of the most striking examples to me that she pulled out was somebody, asked for something in a meeting and said, hey, can we get this data? And the answer was yes, but you need to put that request in an email or in writing. And it took a full month just for that email to get sent to kick things off when they had already asked for it.
Yeah, her story does a great job of describing these kinds of things, but then also starting to show like the death toll and the outbreak stats climb, as a kind of like underlying timeline. And then, the real scramble, which I don't think is controversial at all, occurred after she published her piece about 3 or 4 weeks ago that said there was no urgency about this problem and they were dilly-dallying with these, hand washing stations and stuff like that. And the moment that story comes off, for some reason, well, I know why, but it touches a nerve and it goes viral, becomes a national story, and they start declaring public health emergencies and things like that really mobilize the media and all the outreach.
Well, so there's one revealing aspect in that light, which is Stacey Lemedicos sends an email to the county after that story saying, be sure that the county is aware that they can place these public restrooms and hand washing stations without a permit.
Yeah.
After they had been going through the process for weeks of ensuring that permits were in place first. And now, just the day after that, it's like, look, as long as the permit process is underway, those things can be placed first, and we'll figure out the paperwork later.
Yeah.
It's like, well, what kept that message from being delivered earlier?
Well, and still that theme, though, of like, this is a homeless issue has really crippled this response. And I think still they're like, focus vaccinations on at-risk population. Well, like, no, get everybody vaccinated. Like, it doesn't really matter who is going in. Like, if you're downtown at all, or, get vaccinated. And is there if there's no shortage, get vaccinated.
Right.
And these kinds of debates about at risk or, here's a stat that really got me. So this guy, Ed Blitz, got it. He's one of 116 people who are neither homeless nor illicit drug users, the two classifications they really say have been impacted by this. Some of them are both, who got this. So these are 116 just people who with housed and not illicit drug users who got it. And so they keep brushing that off, but that's like a quarter of the cases.
That in itself would be an outbreak that would be inconsistent with anything we'd ever seen. That alone.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like 100 times what they usually get. I mean, it's it's a lot.
Right.
And so anyway, another stats, 461 cases so far confirmed. Now, obviously, it doesn't count people who just dealt with it because there's no treatment. That's the other thing we learned with the story, too. You just have to sit there and rest.
Deal with it. Yeah.
And get through it. Another thing we touched on, a lot of people were talking about this being just about the Tijuana River and the border sewage issue. Now, look, there is Hep A that sometimes get into the ocean through the border sewage problem, which has been a problem for a long time. But Rai Rivar dug into it, found that the strains of hepatitis A in Baja are different. Yeah. And they've only had 37 reported cases in all of Baja, California. There's 461 up here. It's a different strain, obviously something else going on. And that's just an unfortunate distraction.
Well, there was this weird video that was being viewed like hundreds of thousands of times on Facebook that alleged that this was in fact what was happening. And it seemed to not just prey on anti-immigrant fears, but actually to intentionally tap into them.
Yeah, I first started noticing it a few weeks ago. Just, you get the occasional Twitter troll response to a Hep A story. And, well, this is all coming from Mexico. And obviously it's immigrants. And
you had been
like
seeing that for a while.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so it was one of those things that just kind of took off.
I wonder if folks ever, when they say those sort of things, recognize that San Diego has been on the border of Mexico for quite a while.
I think there's a lot of things they don't realize when
you
fire
off. We're not our geographic location isn't a new phenomenon.
Well, right. And we don't have
time. We have lived here a while.
We don't have time to deal with that. There's this outbreak that's occurring because people are living in filth without shelter in San Diego, along the riverbeds and in the streets, and that needs to be dealt with itself. And the border sewage problem is a huge one we've covered for a long time.
Yeah.
It's just a different problem.
It's a different problem, right, exactly.
Another really gross, different problem.
Different poop problem.
All right, our hero of the week. All right, I'm just going to give a shout to the hospitals in the area who are providing nurses to do vaccinations and treatments out in the community right now. Thank you, UC San Diego. I heard come up. The mayor's been on the phone with a ton of people. He's obviously mobilized now and giving regular updates, but that's one of the things happening. So cheers to them. Our GOAT of the week.
You lose! Good day, sir!
So this week's GOAT is the San Diego County Water Authority, which lost a major case that they took all the way to the Supreme Court. Basically, they had been arguing.
They tried to take it to the Supreme Court.
Sorry, yes, you're our court's
That's
nomenclature person. Basically, they had argued that the Metropolitan Water District. See, we bought a bunch of water from the Imperial Valley.
Yeah, kind of like as a side deal outside of our typical arrangement with the Met.
Yeah, and it's supposed to come through the Metropolitan Water District's own pipes, and that's called wheeling. And we argued that they were charging too much for that. Mm-hmm. And they found that, they're charging a little bit too much, but not the $6 billion that an earlier court had decided. And so we spent, as ratepayers, tens of millions of dollars on both sides fighting this. Now, obviously, there's giant agencies. It's not a huge impact on the rates, but it's a lot of money. And they lost. And it was a lot of wasted time. And it's unfortunate that, the tensions between these two agencies that supposedly serve us.
So now these two agencies will bury the hatchet. And just be on
everything's going to be fine, now. And we're all cool.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
Well, that's
Look forward to it.
So that's the good news.
Yeah. All right, we have Colin Parent coming on. He's talking about driverless cars.
Yeah, he hosted a forum today on autonomous vehicles. Had a lot of experts from all over the world really came in to talk about it. So, hear what he learned.
All right, and please support this service at voiceofsandiego.org/donate. Everything we do, all this investigative work, Lisa's work, Andy's work, the podcast is all dependent on our 2,700 members and corporate sponsors. Go to voiceofsandiego.org/donate to become one of them. And thank you, of course, to our friends and partners at News Radio 600 Go.
This podcast is sponsored in part by the Museum of Photographic Arts. MOPA invites you to attend their photo auction fundraiser on October 14th. Proceeds will provide essential support for MOPA's learning programs and permanent collection. Guests will have the opportunity to bid on works from a selection of world-renowned artists and international photography experiences with artists Doug and Mike Starn, Flor Garduño, and Fazal Sheikh. Visit mopa.org/auction for more information.
Okay, and I'm joined in the great Voice of San Diego podcast studio for, is this the first time?
This is the first time.
First time. With the interim director of Circulate San Diego, Colin Parent.
Thanks.
Also the honorable councilman from La Mesa.
I try to be.
Yes. And so earlier today, and I got to check in there a little bit this morning, you hosted a kind of an all-day forum on autonomous vehicles and the various policy questions that they present. Mm-hmm. And pretty, really an impressive lineup of experts that kind of touch the issue from different directions from all over the country and the world, really, right?
Yeah. I mean, most of the folks that we had participate came from San Diego and California.
Yeah.
But we had the mayor of San Diego provided some opening remarks, and our lunchtime keynote speaker was the chief deputy director for Caltrans HQ in Sacramento.
Yeah, it was good. I thought so. And let me ask you, let's start this way. Why Circulate San Diego put on this specific event?
Yeah, so, Circulate San Diego for the last 3 years, we've really been sort of treating ourselves as a think tank, and not just a policy advocacy organization, not just a fee-for-service firm who does active transportation planning, but also really trying to do some hard thinking about envisioning about what policy needs to be in the San Diego area. And autonomous vehicles is a big part of the conversation that we're having and that we're hearing from folks. It is a technology that claims that it's going to be really disruptive. It probably will be, and I think we're not sure to what extent, how it will be, whether or not it's going to be good, whether or not it's going to be bad, and or to what extent it's going to be good and to what extent it's going to be bad. And so we thought that this would be a worthwhile conversation for us to have, to really talk out what are the pros and cons, what are the risks, what are the potential benefits. And again, it's not just about cars and making it easier to ride cars, or drive cars, but also, there's strong suspicion that people are going to have autonomous transit modes, that autonomous vehicles are potentially going to be more safe, which is very consistent with our interest in our Vision Zero campaign and traffic fatalities. And so we just thought it made a lot of sense for us to weigh in and to have organize a forum so that smart people can get together and talk about it.
So there was a framing that was mentioned by a couple different people this morning when I was there that I thought was interesting, which was whether this will be more of a dystopian idea or a utopian idea, and the tension between those two things, and different people who have different visions of how this might play out, and how policymakers really can intervene to steer it, obviously, into a better direction. And so maybe we start there. What is the utopian vision of the future autonomous vehicle?
Yeah, so I think the utopian vision is that when we no longer have to own cars, we can use mobility as a service, and that is going to free up a lot of resources in people's ordinary budgets, but it's also going to free up a lot of public resources that we dedicate to cars currently. So a good example of that is on-street parking. So if we no longer have to park our cars on the side of the street, then we have all this new real estate that we can put to other uses. Is that we can create pedestrian parks, we can expand our sidewalks, we can put in bike lanes without having to have really difficult conversations about losing parking. That's pretty utopian. We also might be able to build homes much more affordably, because now we no longer have to pay for parking underneath these new homes. We can do that much more affordably and make things easier for people. And I think I think the other big utopian idea is that the autonomous vehicle network that people will have access to will be a great first mile, last mile connector. Allow people to get from their home or their office place to a traditional transit line stop where currently they don't have that option. And
one thing that speakers were pretty cognizant of, I think, was the uncertainty of it all. And not a lot. There wasn't a lot of bold ventures about guessing what the future will be or projecting what the future will be. There was a pretty humble realization that we don't really have a great idea how this will look, and that a lot of these things probably exist on a spectrum, from some things that we could be relatively certain will be something that happens to things that are pretty improbable. What do you think of the things that are, we could be pretty comfortable in projecting will be part of our future in, say, a 10-year time horizon?
Yeah, good question. I think one of the things that we heard pretty consistently from some of the speakers was that they should expect that this technology is going to have an increase in vehicle miles traveled.
Yeah, that was a pretty I had always heard that as still kind of something that was up in the air, but it was more or less a consensus around the fact that this will increase, not decrease, the amount of car travel.
Yeah, and I think that's right, and I think it makes some sense when you think about it. If you make car travel more enjoyable or less burdensome, then more people are going to opt into it, and at least more often.
It's right? A basic induced demand question.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, I ride the trolley to work most days, and I really like that I get to check my email or make phone calls or just read the newspaper on the way into work. That's a competitive advantage that transit has currently. And if autonomous vehicles change that or have that same advantage, then all of a sudden, some people might choose to drive more. And I think that's really a worrying issue. And I think it's all, but also you also hear those figures, but they assume, I think, a pretty standard status quo policy framework around where we're funding our transportation system, right? So if we keep things status quo and you add autonomous vehicles, yeah, you're going to see more vehicle miles traveled. But that's all the more reason to be really thinking critically about whether or not we should be spending as much money on, say, roads, and instead of that, dedicating more funds for non-car infrastructure, for public transit, for bicycle, and for walking. So I think it's still the fact that the technology is coming doesn't change the dynamics that we really need to think about reprioritizing where we're spending our transportation dollars.
Yeah. And then so what would the more dystopic vision of an autonomous future look like?
Well, I think the biggest concern that people have is that if driving becomes more attractive and this is sort of associated with the vehicle miles traveled being increased, then people may be willing to take longer and longer car rides from home to work. And that what that will mean is that you'll see a growth of sprawl development. So right now, sure, some people are willing to live as far out as Temecula and commute into San Diego because of housing affordability and all that. But a lot of people aren't willing to do that because the commute is just too burdensome, right? Mm-hmm. But if the commute, all of a sudden, in that 45 minutes, that hour-long commute isn't not productive, it's or perhaps even enjoyable. You're watching Netflix or talking to your kids on FaceTime, like that is, you could imagine more and more people being willing to do that and developing a market for more and more sprawl development, further exacerbating our greenhouse gas challenges, making it just more separated, more sprawl, chewing up more verdant land. And I think that's really the key dystopian vision. And I think the other thing related to that is that if that does happen, if we start pushing sprawl out, then you also are going to see reinforcement of the sort of car-oriented approach to how we fund transportation. And so if more and more people are going farther and farther out, then we're going to have less interest and pressure to build in meaningful public transit, meaningful density near those transit nodes. And I think that's the dystopian vision, that it really just sort of exacerbates, extends the problems that we've experienced with car-oriented development.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the momentum insofar as there has been on urbanist principles in city policy has been around that there doesn't seem to be much choice in the matter, that we have recognized some of the errors that have been caused, some of the unintended consequences of sprawl, and that as all but a fringe few have accepted the reality of climate change, that we must look for alternatives, and that those alternatives have created some movement where there might not have been some on the left for density, and some willingness on the right to give up sort of the American dream that came with suburban living, and that maybe this is something that would blunt that progress.
Yeah, I think that's a real possibility, and something that we have to reckon with. Right, and I think, but again, it's sort of more of the same, right? It's still like cars versus other things, and from our perspective at Circulate, we think cars are here to stay, and we're not trying to get rid of people's cars. I mean, I drove a car downtown because I had a bunch of stuff to carry into the conference this morning, and but it's also true that the way that we've structured our transportation networks is that they prioritize cars really at the expense of all other modes, and we need to figure out ways to rebalance that. And so I think when you're the autonomous vehicles situation, it's more of the same, right? Yeah. And so we're still, if we want to make them work and want to make them be a success for cities, we need to balance that with ensuring that we have success for those other modes.
Yeah. So were there any tangible policy takeaways that you heard voiced, or that you could have sussed out from the conversations that were happening, that policymakers could take away and say, these are things we really need to be giving consideration, not down the line, not in the back end of our 40-year transportation plan, but right now we should maybe start having some conversations about?
Yeah, some, but those are still pretty iffy too.
Yeah.
Right. We have a proving ground, and autonomous vehicles proving ground in the San Diego area with San Diego and Chula Vista and Sandag as part of that, and they're really in just sort of an exploratory phase. They're just kind of trying to look at it. One thing that I thought was really interesting, Comey from Caltrans, explained that one industry entity explained to Caltrans that they had. Their autonomous vehicles were trying to read the highway lanes, yeah, and they were having difficulty too. And so that Caltrans actually is responding by restriping their entire network differently, so that these vehicles are better able to see the road, right? And so that's a real policy change that's happening today.
Not exactly one that we could say has any real tangible effect on any other element of life.
Well,
I mean, that's about
right.
as minor as it gets,
Yeah.
right? It's like,
well, but one of the things that he also said though which was I think totally correct, is that if when autonomous vehicles are coming on board, the one of the things that there's a fair consensus is that you will be able to accommodate more cars on existing highway and freeway infrastructure, right?
Yeah.
And so with that being the case, we will not have to spend as much time and energy and resources expanding existing highway infrastructure. Now, and that's a pretty amazing thing to hear from a high up in Caltrans, right?
Yeah.
I mean, they're like the freeway entity of the the biggest freeway entity of the United States. And he certainly was also very clear that he still believes that certain freeway expansions are still necessary and will happen. But that's a real different perspective than what we've been hearing. And in fact, I don't believe that there's anything in the Sandag regional plan currently that says, hey, that freeway widening that we were planning to do, we're going to take that out of the plan because we think autonomous vehicles are gonna make that unnecessary. You haven't heard that here locally, but maybe after today and after some of these further conversations, we're gonna be talking more seriously about that.
well, right. So that's the thing that I actually have heard is, why are we going to spend $1.5 billion on a trolley line if there's if there's this potential future with autonomous cars? So while it could change the conversation around freeways, it could also change the conversation around transit investment as well.
Yeah, no, that's true. But it's still the reality though is that even if you have the greatest autonomous vehicle network that you might imagine, it's still much more efficient both in terms of cost and in terms of physical space to move people together in a transit vehicle than it is individual autonomous vehicles on an existing freeway. It just doesn't. They really don't compare.
Right. Well, and so you had somebody from MTS who was talking specifically about that, about what this means for transit entities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah, and I think how this affects transit is it's really interesting, and there are some autonomous transit lines. I think the L line in New York is autonomous, and although
maybe
I think
some
they
of
may
those
have a
monorail lines, like either like Orlando or Vegas or something like that,
could be.
Maybe not.
Yeah. We haven't been focusing on monorails at the Circulate San Diego. We think that's probably not the right solution for us.
Simpsons fans.
Yeah, exactly. But I think that is a real interesting thing, and it's going to be a real challenge. I mean, think about we have a lot of people who make their living in middle class jobs, driving the bus or driving the trolley, and it could be very disruptive to just immediately say, hey, we don't need that anymore. And so I think that
sort of question came up a little bit, say, in our most recent presidential election about those sorts of things. So yeah, I think if for anyone who leaps at what the possibilities mean for transit, they should also grapple with that other side of it, because it's something that we haven't always grappled with in terms of automation, and it's created some political backlash.
Yeah, absolutely. And even if it makes sense on paper, so you can run this line a lot cheaper without without a driver. Well, there's some human costs associated with that. Not to mention just the political challenges.
Yeah.
How do you reach consensus to do something like that? I think one of the things that shows perhaps more promise on that is on the autonomous transit situation is that there is existing rural transportation lines or transit lines that really don't make any financial sense. I mean, they're just major losers. But we maintain them because of equity reasons, right? We want to make sure that people, even in these far-flung areas, still have access to transportation. There might be better, more efficient ways to address those folks through perhaps an autonomous vehicle, right? Things that maybe things that don't run on fixed lines, right?
Yeah.
So I think
almost like paratransit.
Yeah, that's right. And frankly, paratransit too, right? I mean, paratransit too. You can imagine some of that, but again, I think that's that's a really a sticky issue, and it's going to be a challenge to work out. I think the fortunate thing though is that there's going to be a fairly long runway between now and the sort of the final version of totally autonomous vehicles, right? Yeah. So we can anticipate there being a substantial amount of time where even when you have mostly autonomous vehicles, we're still going to want to have a driver in that, right? People aren't going to get into a bus with no driver today, without getting eased into that. And so you might imagine an amount of time, maybe even a decade, where you have people who are they get on a bus and the bus is basically autonomous, but there's still a guy who's out there making sure that things go right.
Yeah. And so what you had folks from this company EZMile, or one woman at least from this company EZMile, which builds, people might have seen photos of them, the very little boxy shuttles. They hold like 10 people. And they're doing, their business model right now is these small pilot programs basically that do really simple, you could call it first mile, last mile, but it's not really even that. It's like the types of transportation that normally you have like somebody driving a golf cart doing, like taking you from a parking area at a golf course for a special event to the first hole, that type of thing. And while it's interesting that that's happening, that's also a pretty modest endeavor in the grand scheme of things when you compare it to some of the grand visions of autonomous vehicles. And so one thing I found myself thinking about this morning was how many checkpoints we're likely to see between these early adoption type programs and whatever the 40, 50 year time horizon is. So like I could see something like that what was it, EZMile? EZMile doing like something like Fred, essentially. Like if it replaces something, it would be a potentially a replacement for Fred. But even Fred, that's it's a pretty modest program. It doesn't really move that many people. So I don't know. It's interesting to see that that sort of thing is already happening to some extent, but it also seems it's just still hard for me to see any sort of widespread adoption. So I don't know. What are your thoughts on those sorts of like almost like jitney substitutes? That's basically what they are, is jitneys.
Yeah, I actually, I'm a little skeptical about that. Right. I think the idea that you're going to take some of these flexible transit lines or transit solutions, or flexible autonomous transit solutions. It makes some sense. It's sort of like like Lyft line or Uber Pool, right? So just use that, and you just use a bigger vehicle, and you'll have a few more people, and the route will constantly change and all that. And I think there's probably that would make sense in certain areas. I think downtowns maybe make more sense to the extent if you can't walk downtown. I walk downtown. Campus
environments like a Qualcomm campus.
I think campus environments, they make a lot of sense. That's something that EZMile is really strongly looking at, and that makes a lot of sense for that. But I don't think that those things end up being a real replacement for transit, because I think really what you want, if you have a really robust system for that, you're talking about putting those vehicles on the regular road, competing with regular cars, and it's still going to take a fair amount of time. I think the real solution where cities and regions have been really successful in making investments, including to some extent San Diego, is doing dedicated transit lanes, dedicated bus lanes, allowing them to not compete with the regular car.
You think that's something we've been good at here?
No, we've been working on it. Yeah,
okay.
No, I'm well aware of the problems that we had and the good reporting the Voice of San Diego has done on that. So
yeah, thank you.
But there are a lot of BRT lines that are planned in San Diego, right? And there's a lot of stuff that hopefully will be better. But
right now we're planning for the dedicated lanes that we're going to negotiate away before that they get implemented.
Well, hopefully we don't. Hopefully we don't. But that's the sort of thing where you can get a really fast surface street transit line that's really effective and great if it's on a fixed route. But you can't do that if the autonomous vehicle is not on a fixed route.
Yeah.
And so I think that's one of the key limitations on this sort of flexible transit model that some people are really keen to promote.
Yeah. So and then in the immediate term, one of the things that I took away from this was that this conversation has quite a bit to do with things that aren't autonomous at all. Car2Go, Lyft, Uber, these social network transportation systems. And one of the things, Susan Shaheen, she's a professor at Berkeley.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. She pointed out that that was interesting. Somebody asked her, why did Car2Go fail in San Diego? And her answer was pretty simple, was density. Mm-hmm. That Car2Go has realized that the key ingredient to its success is to have an adequate density that brings a critical mass of people that can support the system. Mm-hmm. And that, Uber and Lyft kind of thrive on that same thing, and that a lot of these systems really rely on basic population density. That was interesting to me because so much of this conversation seems to be held up as a reason that we don't, in fact, need to increase urban densities because there's a solution coming. Oh, it's what about Uber and Lyft? What about autonomous cars? And at least for now, it seems like that's the opposite of that is actually the case, that these things can only survive with density, which is interesting that they seem to rely on the same basic planning principles that we would have held up that transit needs to rely on and that cycling needs to rely on and that pedestrian and walkability needs to rely on.
Yeah, I think that's a good observation, but I think it's also true that some of those folks who say, hey, we don't have to worry about density because the autonomous vehicles are coming, they might be right. Maybe it'll turn out that that'll simply facilitate more sprawl, the kind of sprawl that the automobile has already facilitated.
Or hyper sprawl, as you mentioned before, the true dystopic version.
Yeah, that's right. So I think that it's possible those folks are right, but I think it's also true that that's not a good outcome, right? And that when we're talking about compact development, or when we're talking about allowing people to be able to walk or to take transit to work, there's a lot of value to that, irrespective of whether or not you can use a car to do it.
Yeah.
Right. And so that again, we're still back into the more of the same. That it's still valuable to allow for more new urbanism and that kind of reshaping of our urban landscape, and that the autonomous vehicle certainly potential for that certainly informs the conversation, but it I don't think it really changes it.
Yeah, and so now, like, when you finance any sort of major commercial development, typically it's like a 30-year financing timeline. So that means a parking garage being built today will be paid for in 30 years. If one of the other things that people this is one thing that there seemed to be a lot of dissent on, whether it would increase the need for parking or whether it would decrease the need for parking. It's maybe tilting mostly to decreasing the need for parking, I think. I don't know. But have you heard of anything? Are you aware of any discussions about people wondering about the financial problems posed by large downtown parking garages that are being financed today on a 30-year timeline, if people seriously believe that these sorts of solutions might be on the horizon within 30 years?
I haven't, but I think one of the big reasons for that is that the studies that I've seen show that the parking in buildings in places like downtown are subsidized by the other uses in that building, and that the parking actually isn't a huge component of the financing. It's not that it's none, but there was a report, I believe it was by Sightline a few years ago, that looked at this, and they were basically showing that even in buildings that sold that rented out parking separately from the other units, they still weren't charging enough for parking to actually pay for the parking, and which is it's a good reminder that that parking is a drag on building costs and housing costs in particular. But I think right. So but I think what that also means is that if we end up not using that space for parking, it probably is not going to have a giant impact on the financing of the project. But I think what may be more important is not the financing, but then if we're not using it,
what do we do with it?
What do we do with it, and how do we retrofit it for different purposes? One thing that developers are doing on a growing basis now is they are designing their parking garages so they can be converted, so that they're flat, they're not on an angle. Yeah, that's right. And so the people are thinking in long term ways about how they're going to use that space.
Yeah. All right. So we should probably start to try to wrap up here. But I'm curious. What did you take away any big thoughts that you just hadn't been aware of, that were essentially new to you? Or maybe another way to ask that is, were your whatever sorts of fears that you had about this, or were any of those allayed today?
Well, I think one thing that I wasn't really aware of is that it seemed to be there's a broader consensus than I understood for the idea that the autonomous vehicle was going to increase vehicle miles traveled.
Yeah.
There are a lot of hopeful. I've read some hopeful thoughts that it's going to be the opposite, and it seemed like there was a strong consensus that wasn't the case.
A little bit similar to like Lyft and Uber. I remember when Lyft and Uber first launched, there was some thought like, well, maybe this will make it so you don't have to own a car, and then sometimes you do Lyft and Uber, and sometimes you do transit, but seems like there's enough data and the jury's pretty much out that they've hurt transit.
Maybe I think they've heard. I think the data is that they've heard bus lines.
Yeah.
Okay. but not rail.
Okay.
Which is an
Fair
interesting
enough.
observation.
That's interesting.
Yeah. And actually, you've seen that. It's hard to say whether or not it's Lyft and Uber, but you've seen that in some of the big jurisdictions around the country. The bus ridership has been going down, whereas rail ridership has really been popping up.
Okay.
So probably a lot of different reasons for that, but that's interesting. But and I think but in terms of like, are there things that I was afraid of that I'm less afraid of? No, actually, I think that all the things that we're worried about are things that we should be worried about, right? It doesn't mean that they're not going to provide a lot of value in a lot of different ways once they as they roll out. But I do think that there has to be some really thoughtful policy choices made to make sure that that dystopian outcome doesn't happen. I think with perhaps the one exception on that where I'm not really worried about anything is I'm a good worrier, but where I'm fairly confident is the potential for the autonomous vehicle to really improve safety.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that's really likely to occur. And actually in something from an organization like Circulate, we have to think through, well, how important is that as valued against some of these other things, right? Should we entertain some degree of extra sprawl if it means that people aren't going to die in our streets? Yeah, that's a question we really have to.
Well, after all, the
about.
opposition to sprawl was not for sprawl for sprawl's sake. It was because of its effects on basic issues like health and
Sure.
Climate change. It wasn't an a priori opposition to sprawl itself.
Mm-hmm.
So if on balance it came in to be a safety increase, then it would be something you'd have to consider.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's something public policy is really going to have to think through.
Yeah, there was one panelist who maybe you remember his name. I don't, but he had a really compelling presentation. But he made a comparison with some early photos of automobiles in cities in 1920s when the notion of jaywalking had not been introduced, and so the public right-of-way was one where you routinely saw cars, people walking freely through the streets. There were sidewalks, but there was no real distinction between pedestrians belong here and not here. Mm-hmm. And then later, the concept of jaywalking was introduced. People no longer belong in the streets, and that if autonomous cars have the intelligence to recognize a human has stepped in front of them, then you might actually see a return to that old way where pedestrians feel completely entitled to walk into the right-of-way.
Yeah, we can only hope.
We can only hope. Captain Vision Zero.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, do you want to plug Captain Vision Zero?
Yeah, Captain VZ. So
Okay.
Circulate San Diego, we just launched our Captain Vision Zero videos earlier this week. Something we did with the San Diego Police Department. We're excited to partner with them. And we have a superhero, San Diego's newest superhero, Captain VZ, who's helping to educate everyone how to be a Vision Zero hero.
And that's you in a costume.
It is
you
it is,
in tights and a cape and a wig and everything.
It really should be. I only do that at home, but we have a very good sport staff member who was able to do that with us, and we have to do some nice things for her for that.
Yeah. All right. Colin Parent, Interim Director of Circulate San Diego and Councilman for the City of La Mesa.
All right. Thank you very much, Andy.
Thanks, man.
The show you just heard was part of the Voice of San Diego Podcast Network. To hear other great shows like the Voice of San Diego podcast, I Made It in San Diego, a show all about the people behind the region's businesses, The Kept Faith, a San Diego sports show, the binational Curacaos podcast, Startup Vault, the San Diego Beer Talk Radio, and more, please visit voiceofsandiego.org/podcasts. If you'd like to sponsor any of the podcasts, please email Aaron at voiceofsandiego.org. That's ERIN@VOSD.org.